Because history takes place in space as well as in time, before we lay out the narratives of our empires, we first need to investigate the geography of the world within which they rose and fell. That world, the world of the ancient Near East, was a vast one. It sprawled across 5,000 miles from India to the Atlantic and included parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa, as well as the Mediterranean Sea. Let's start by looking at where the geographical features of our planet come from. Since the 1960s, geologists have realized that those geographical features result from the process of continental drift, also known as plate tectonics. So we now understand that the Earth's surface is made up of more than a dozen large plates which move around slowly but inexorably, driven by powerful currents inside the planet. Plates come in two basic types, continental and oceanic, and the landforms we're all familiar with are the product of their interaction. Continental plates are made of lighter rocks. Ocean plates are made of heavier ones, usually volcanic rocks like basalt. The lighter continental plates collide with ocean plates. They ride up over them. Same way that running your car into some solid object crumples the edge of your car, this collision crumples the edges of the continents, producing mountains and earthquakes. It also forces the heavy ocean rocks down into the earth, where they melt. The molten rock then rises through the fractures in the solid crust above as lava, which is where we get most of our volcanoes from. In the area we're traversing in this course, no fewer than 4 major tectonic plates are grinding and smashing against one another. In the west, the African plate is crushing against the Eurasian plate. The Mediterranean, its islands, and the coastlands that surround it are the product of this slow-motion train wreck. Mediterranean's actually all that's left of the old Tethys Sea, which was an ocean to be reckoned with back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. These days is slowly being squeezed out of existence. In addition to extinguishing the old Tethys Sea, the collision of Africa and Eurasia is also forcing up the mountain ridges that rim southern Europe. The Pyrenees, the Alps, the Apennines all result from this. It's also caused violent earthquakes, and by melting the rocks of the old ocean basin, it's given birth to some of the world's most notorious volcanoes, like Etna and Vesuvius. To the east side of the Mediterranean, a different tectonic process is going on. The Arabian plate is tearing itself away from the African plate. The Arabian Peninsula and its nearby seas are the result. This has opened up a great rift in the Earth's surface. It's one of the world's most famous places. The Jordan River flows along its depths into the Dead Sea, the sea which is the lowest spot on the planet's land surface. South of the Dead Sea, ocean waters have flooded the rift. On the map, we see the flooded chasm as the Gulf of Aqaba, and beyond that, as the Red Sea. As the Arabian plate separates from Africa, it's pushing north against the Eurasian plate. Their collision has raised up the great Taurus and Zagros mountains of modern Turkey and Iran. Finally, in the east, the Indian plate is also smashing into the Eurasian plate. And since, when 2 continental plates collide, neither one will go down, both are going up. The result is the greatest mountain ridges on Earth, the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas. In the middle of all this geological mayhem lies the main stage on which the empires explored in this course rose, ruled, and died. The region encompassing modern Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, and Turkey, known today as the Middle East. At the heart of this region is the area known as the Fertile Crescent. It stretches from the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates to Syria, and then down between the Jordan River Rift Valley and the waters of the Mediterranean. The term Fertile Crescent is actually something of a misnomer. It's historical, not geological in origin. It was coined in 1916 by the Egyptologist J.H. Breasted as a label for the regions where agriculture and civilization arose. For the most part, the soil in these areas isn't really very fertile. It's just that a combination of seasonal rains and the availability of water for irrigation made agriculture easier there than it was in the deserts and the mountains to either side. At either end of the Fertile Crescent are the great river valleys that more than any other features define the ancient Near East in popular imagination. The broad valley shared by the rivers that Sumerians called the Idiglot and the Boranum, the Greeks called the Tigris and the Euphrates, is known by the Greek name Mesopotamia because it's between the rivers. Mesopotamia has grown since ancient times. Silting has pushed the coastline about 100 miles down the Persian Gulf. Ponder the fact that most of modern Kuwait and a significant chunk of southern Iraq didn't even exist 4,000 years ago. When people think of ancient Near Eastern rivers, they naturally tend to think of flooding. The Tigris and the Euphrates actually do flood, but their flooding depends on the weather in the mountains of Armenia, where both rivers rise. Snowfall, spring thaws, rainfall, and so forth. So when flooding occurs, it tends to happen without warning. It also tends to happen sometime during the growing season, which gave floods a very bad reputation among the people of Lower Mesopotamia, who tended to associate flooding with chaos and see it as an indication that the gods were really, really mad at them. On the other hand, of course, as long as the gods were happy and the rivers behaved themselves, it was the Tigris and the Euphrates that made life in Mesopotamia possible. They were the source of the irrigation water that sustained the crops, that sustained the population. Mesopotamia is bordered to the south by the arid grasslands, the so-called desert fringe. These were inhabited by clans of nomadic herdsmen. Herdsmen also inhabited the Zagros Mountains, which are as high as the Rockies and frown down on the river plains from the north and east. For some mysterious reason, the peoples of Mesopotamia never made any serious attempt to conquer either the Zagros or the desert fringe, so they always remained vulnerable to raids by these mountain and desert nomads. Combined with the capricious flooding of the rivers, these raids made life in Mesopotamia very insecure. On the far side of the Fertile Crescent from Mesopotamia lies the other great river valley, even more famous than Mesopotamia, the Valley of the Nile. The longest river on Earth at nearly 4,150 miles, the Nile originates in two branches, the Blue Nile in Ethiopia and the White Nile in Tanzania. The branches join together in the Sudan and modern Khartoum. From there they flow north to the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands of years ago, when sea levels were much lower during the various ice ages, the Nile carved a deep canyon through the desert of northeast Africa. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, the canyon gradually silted up, filling with fertile sediments. As a result, for the last 10,000 years, the Nile has made the last 1,000 miles of its journey through a narrow valley 10 to 15 miles wide, flanked by walls several hundred feet high, all that's left of that canyon. That narrow valley is called Upper Egypt because it lies upstream on the Nile. Where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, it spreads out into a broad fan of channels and marshes, shaped like the Greek letter delta, which is why the Greeks called it the Delta of the Nile. Otherwise, it's known as Lower Egypt because it lies downstream on the river. It does rain in Egypt, but only rarely, so the Nile was tapped for water to irrigate the fields within its valley. The Nile also assured the fertility of its valley by flooding reliably and predictably each year during the fallow season, laying down a fresh layer of virgin soil and leaching out the salts that can rob soil of its vitality. For this reason, the Egyptians viewed the floods not as divine punishment, but rather as divine blessings. Beyond the cliffs, the valley of the Nile is flanked by deserts, both to the east and to the west. The natives named the Nile Valley the Black Land, from the color of its rich soil. The lands that stretch out beyond the tops of the cliffs they're called the Red Land, because they're nothing but sun-scorched desert. But thanks to their barrenness, these inhospitable deserts also provide the Nile Valley with excellent natural defenses and a high degree of natural security. The coastal zone of the eastern Mediterranean that forms the western edge of the Fertile Crescent is called the Levant. It comprises the modern countries of Israel and Lebanon and the western parts of Syria. East of the Levant, beyond the Rift Valley that carries the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, lie the arid grasslands that fringe the Arabian Desert. Between the Jordan River and the coastal plain is an upland zone of hill country that was home in antiquity to small villages of herdsmen. The coastal plain offered the best communications route between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and control of it, therefore, was hotly disputed among the powers of the Near East. The lucrative trade routes that brought goods from Asia to the Mediterranean and vice versa terminated at the harbors along the northern coast of the Levant, the area that came to be known as Phoenicia. So control over the northern Levant was also hotly disputed. Northwest of the Fertile Crescent lies Asia Minor, or Anatolia. The name Asia Minor is Latin, means Lesser Asia. Anatolia is Greek and means the East. Anatolia is the name by which the region will be called in this course. Anatolia is a great 600-mile-long plateau, thrust up by the collision of Eurasia, Africa, and Arabia. It averages about 3,000 feet above sea level, and it's ringed by mountains, the highest of which, the Taurus, along the border with Syria, have peaks as much as 10,000 feet high. The plateau itself is hilly and semi-arid. It only gets about 15 to 20 inches of rain each year and often has cold winters. Being so dry, it doesn't have much in the way of rivers. The only one of any size in the plateau is the Halys. Anatolia is surrounded by seas on three sides: the Black Sea to the north, the Aegean to the west, and the Mediterranean to the south. The mountains of northern Anatolia make access to the Black Sea very difficult. As a result, Anatolia tends to be oriented more towards the west, where there are good harbors on the Aegean coast, and toward the southeast, where the passes through the Taurus Mountains leading into Syria carried important trade routes. East of the Fertile Crescent lies another great mountainous region, Iran. The Zagros Mountains form the western border of Iran. They run from the northwest to the southeast and extend more than 1,000 miles from Armenia to the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. The peaks of the Zagros are as much as 14,700 feet high. The Zagros form a barrier against Mesopotamia because their easily defended ridges sharply restrict access to the interior of Iran. The plain of Elam, modern Khuzestan, forms a border zone between the mountains of southwestern Iran and lower Mesopotamia. In antiquity, Elam tended to look more towards Iran than towards Mesopotamia, the same way Khuzestan looks toward Iran today. The northern border of Iran is formed by the Elborz Mountains, which lie along the southern shore of the Caspian Sea. The highest peak in Iran is in the Elborz, the great dormant volcano Damavand, which stands more than 18,000 feet above sea level. The interior of Iran is even more arid than the interior of Anatolia, with near deserts in the east and southeast. Both in ancient and modern times, therefore, population has tended to concentrate in the west and the north, in the foothills and valleys of the mountains. Bactria, modern Afghanistan, is geologically speaking a part of the Iranian plateau region. Arid semi-desert in the south, Bactria is extremely mountainous otherwise, rising to the Hindu Kush in the northeast, whose peaks reach as high as 20,000 feet and more. The mountains of Bactria look down on the great valley of the Indus River, a valley that was fought over in antiquity by the rulers of India and whatever power controlled Iran. The other geographical arena for this course is the Mediterranean basin. Centered on the landlocked Mediterranean Sea, which extends nearly 2,300 miles from the Straits of Gibraltar, the ancient Pillars of Hercules, to the Levant. The Mediterranean basin is divided into two unequal parts by the Italian peninsula and the island of Sicily. The western Mediterranean is tightly hemmed in by rugged landmasses and is studded with islands. On the European side, it's bordered by the Iberian Peninsula, southern France, known as Gaul in antiquity, and by Italy. To the south lies the coast of northwest Africa, modern Algeria, known as the Maghreb, a rugged land rising to the peaks of the Atlas Mountains, south of which lies the Sahara Desert. The Balearic Islands off the Iberian coast and the great islands of Sardinia and Corsica over towards Italy complete the picture. Few extensive areas of good farmland are found in the coastlands of the western Mediterranean. but there are plenty of good ports. The eastern Mediterranean is about twice the size of the western Mediterranean and much more open, with only two major islands, which are located along its northern edge, Cyprus and Crete. The southern coast is largely desert. The only good arable land is in the region of Cyrenaica, which bulges north from the eastern part of modern Libya. To the east lies the Levant. To the southeast lies the Nile Delta and Egypt. Cyprus has always served as a way station between the Aegean and the Levant, and both in antiquity and today has a mixed population drawn from Greece and also from the nearby mainland. Although intimately linked with the Mediterranean basin, the Aegean Sea and its adjacent lands often seem to be a world apart. The islands that dot the Aegean Sea served as bridges between its western and eastern shores, tended to link the people who lived along its coasts and to turn the Aegean into a single community rather than a border between Asia and Europe. The eastern shore of the Aegean is the western coast of Anatolia, but the rugged Anatolian geography tended to isolate the coastal zone from the interior and orient its people towards the sea. The western shore of the Aegean is formed by the mountainous region of Greece, which is a southern extension of the Balkan Peninsula of Europe. The mountains divide Greece up into dozens of small valleys, which promotes political fragmentation and inhibited the formation of a large unified state until modern times. The intimate relationship of mountains and sea gives Greece a coastline deeply penetrated by bays and inlets, with hundreds of good safe harbors that tend to make its coastal inhabitants a seafaring people. The southern boundary of the Aegean is marked off by the island of Crete, 60 miles beyond the southernmost tip of Greece. Crete lies east to west, 160 miles long, but only 40 miles wide at its widest, typically more like 20, with a ridge of mountains as much as 8,000 feet high running down its spine. Since its northern side has more open terrain, and to its south lies only the empty sea, the inhabitants of Crete tend to look towards the Aegean, Greece, and Anatolia. Good harbors incline its people to be sailors too. The Aegean is the most geologically active area of the ancient Near East, prone to frequent, strong earthquakes. Some of its islands are actually volcanoes. Of these, the most active is Thera, 70 miles north of Crete. Since it first erupted a 250,000 years ago, Thera has gone through a half dozen major cycles of growth and destruction, and during the Bronze Age exploded catastrophically in one of the greatest eruptions of the last 10,000 years. The Balkans and Anatolia face one another across the narrow straits that connect the Black Sea with the Aegean, straits known as the Bosporus and the Hellespont, or Dardanelles. Control over these straits confers control not only over water traffic between the two seas, but also over land travel between Europe and the Near East, making this one of the most strategic and hotly contested locations in southeastern Europe. This was the reason why Constantine chose it for the site of Rome's eastern capital, Constantinople, and this is what made Troy wealthy and powerful. So, to sum up, nature has built for us a complex stage for our story, with ancient seas, lofty mountains, exploding volcanoes, violent earthquakes, rivers going over their banks, and fertile plains ringed by vast deserts and greedy nomads. The lands and the seas don't tell the story themselves, though. Our ability to explore the history of any place or any era is based on the availability of sources and on the nature of those sources. The availability and nature of the sources for the empires of the ancient Near East have a particularly profound effect on how we can discuss those empires' histories. The two basic types of evidence we use in exploring ancient history are documentary and archaeological. These two have a very complex relationship. Documentary evidence means written sources. The most important written sources are called primary sources. That is, documents that were written during antiquity, even though they usually aren't contemporary with the events that they describe. Secondary sources refer to the works written about antiquity by modern scholars. Archaeological evidence is the material remains derived from the excavation of ancient sites. Those excavations often recover documentary evidence, which gives such documents an archaeological flavor. For the most part, though, what archaeological excavations do is reveal the structures and artifacts that constituted the physical environment and tools of ancient life. Archaeological evidence has both strengths and weaknesses in exploring the history of an era. Its greatest strength is its fundamental honesty. Except in those rare cases of forgery, the material objects recovered by archaeologists can't lie about what they are. A brick is just a brick. A bone is just a bone. They have no agenda other than their brickiness and their boniness. But on the downside, archaeological evidence also can't do much to explain itself. It's mute. If you find an Egyptian pot on a Greek site, the pot can't tell you what it's doing there. Did it come there through trade? Was it loot from a pirate raid? If it was trade, was the trade a one-time thing, or was it regular? Did a Greek get it in Egypt, or did an Egyptian bring it to Greece? If it was pirate loot, how frequent was the piracy? How severe was the raid? Destruction layers really exemplify this problem of muteness. If you find a destruction layer in a site, you know the site was destroyed. The problem is, you don't know why. There's a destruction layer under downtown Chicago that the coins associated with it will tell you dates to the early 1870s. But what the evidence can't tell you is why Chicago was destroyed. Was it a devastating raid by savage Packer fans from Green Bay? Or was it a cranky cow that kicked over a lantern? So if archaeological evidence is all we have for an empire, it becomes nearly impossible to reconstruct that empire's history in any sort of detail. We're left talking about changes in building styles and the shapes and decorations of pots, trying to divine from such things what was going on politically and economically. There are several empires covered in this course for which we either have only archaeological evidence or for which the documentary evidence is so limited we have to rely on the archaeological evidence for the lion's share of our information. Minoan Crete, Mycenaean Greece, Mitanni and the Kassite Empire in Babylonia. Given the limitations of archaeological evidence, documentary evidence is fundamental to reconstructing the history of any people, culture, nation, or era. It's the very stuff of history, so much so that, strictly speaking, history begins with the dawn of writing 5,300 years ago. Documentary evidence comes in many forms. Historical writings, such as those of Greek and Roman authors. These would also include annals or lists of events. Government archives, such as correspondence and memoranda, as well as personal archives such as property transactions, birth, death, and marriage records. Inscriptions, texts carved on stone or metal, also come in a variety of forms. Funerary memorials to the dead, votive texts dedicated to some deity, building inscriptions associated with the construction or repair of structures, commemorative inscriptions publicizing some event or achievement. Historians have to treat documentary evidence with more skepticism than they apply to material evidence. Every author, no matter how honest, must choose what to write about, and therefore must also choose what not to write about. No author can give a complete account of any event, because to do so would involve so much detail that it would take a lifetime or longer to write. So every author must also choose what to emphasize and what to omit. This means that every author has an agenda, even if they're trying not to have one. Most of them aren't trying to avoid that, so historians have to try to identify what those agendas are and how they shape an author's point of view and treatment of his material. No historian should ever take any documentary evidence at face value. Documentary sources are very unevenly distributed, both as to their nature and geographically among the empires of the ancient Near East, and this strongly shapes the sorts of narratives we can provide of those empires' histories. For some empires, we have no historical writings, but lots of archival material, thanks to the discovery of royal or municipal records libraries with large caches of cuneiform tablets. Third Dynasty Ur, for example, has yielded nearly 1 million cuneiform texts. We also have tens or hundreds of thousands of cuneiform texts from Assyria, Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Hatti, the Empire of the Hittites. Unfortunately, our discovery of these troves of records depends on luck, and their contents don't always illuminate political events. Archaeological sites are large places, and since time and money are limited, archaeologists have to be selective about where they dig. And it's impossible to know where the ruins of the records office and its contents might be located. Most of these records are also the sorts of things you'd find today in the archives of a county courthouse. Deeds, marriage records, transfers of ownership over livestock and slaves. Very little of its correspondence between royal officials or between rulers. This means that we may be able to discuss marriage practices in some city in considerable detail, but not have a clue how that city fit into the broader administrative picture of the empire which it was a part, much less the history of that empire's origins, rise, and fall. For other empires, we have no archival material at all, but plenty of historical writing. So we can present a good narrative, at least for the periods covered by those writings, but don't always have the down-to-earth detail that archival material provides us with. Prime examples of this situation in this course are Persia, Carthage, and Israel. None of them has yielded more than a handful of archives, but Greek historians wrote extensively about Greco-Persian relations, and Roman authors did the same with respect to Carthage, while the temple scribes in Jerusalem compiled narratives of their people's past that were then incorporated into the Hebrew scriptures. But because the texts that contain these historical writings had to be copied in order to survive from antiquity to the present, many of them have been lost, and that leaves our narratives of those histories fragmented. Furthermore, all of these authors had their own perspectives, their own agendas, which shaped how they wrote their narratives, and often those perspectives perceptibly skew the results. Greek writers were only interested in those aspects of Persian history that had to do with the Greeks, so they didn't write about what happened elsewhere in the Persian Empire. They also had a stereotype of Persian culture to which they adhered in portraying the Persians, contrasting them unfavorably with their own people and culture. Roman writers had much the same baggage in writing about Carthaginian history and the Carthaginian character. We don't learn much about Carthage that wasn't of direct relevance to its conflict with Rome. And in that conflict, Roman writers were quite clear about who was the bad guy. The temple scribes understood that the only reason there was a temple was because of the Davidic monarchy, and the accounts they give of David and Solomon reflect that appreciation, as they also reflect the scribes' strong devotion to the cult of Yahweh. Then there are a few empires for which we have neither narratives nor archives, so we can barely sketch the outlines of their histories, with few details to give those outlines flesh and life. So, in sum, the lectures offered in this course cannot help but mirror the diverse nature of the sources that are available to us, which in turn mirror the diverse nature of the empires that spanned the world of the ancient Near East. Some will be three-dimensional narratives of great victories and catastrophic defeats, of good and just kings, or of cruel tyrants in living color. Others will be more like sketches of rulers and their realms, their conquests and losses, their courts and provinces, snapshots in black and white, viewed in sequence. And others will be like phantoms, fleeting glimpses of empires, their rulers' names lost, their wars forgotten, their rise and fall hinted at only in the buried remains of palaces and the garbled myths of a long-gone age. Such are the stories of the empires of the ancient Near East, stories which began in Lower Mesopotamia 1,000 years after the dawn of civilization.